It was a quiet evening, the kind where the world feels like it's slowing down just for you. The sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. General Danielle Rivers was driving home after a long day at Fort Bragg. She wasn't in uniform that night, just a regular civilian car, a simple blouse and jeans. It was her way of unwinding, blending into the rhythm of everyday life outside the military walls. Danielle had spent decades climbing the ranks in the U.S. Army, becoming one of the highest-ranking black women in its history. Her achievements were nothing short of extraordinary, but tonight she wasn't thinking about medals or accolades. She was thinking about dinner, maybe catching up on some rest. Life seemed peaceful until she approached a red light near the edge of town. That's when it happened. 2 police cars pulled up behind her, their lights flashing brightly in the rearview mirror. Danielle frowned, confused. She hadn't been speeding, hadn't run any lights. What could this be about? As she rolled down her window, 2 officers stepped out of their vehicles. One was tall with broad shoulders, the other shorter, wiry and quick on his feet. They walked toward her car with an air of authority that felt off. The taller officer leaned down to peer into her window. "License and registration," he barked, his tone sharp and impatient. Danielle blinked, taken aback by the abruptness. Still, she stayed calm. This wasn't her first encounter with law enforcement, and she knew how these things worked. She reached slowly for her purse, pulling out her license while explaining herself. "I'm not sure why I've been stopped," she said evenly, meeting his gaze. "I haven't broken any rules." But instead of softening, the officer's expression hardened. "Broken taillight," he muttered, pointing vaguely toward the back of her car. Danielle glanced at her rearview mirror. Sure enough, both taillights were intact, glowing red against the dark road. Something didn't add up here. She tried again, this time more firmly. "Sir, my taillights are working fine. Can you double-check?" The second officer chimed in now, his voice laced with irritation. "We're telling you there's a problem. Don't argue with us." "Argue?" Danielle thought. "I'm just asking questions." But before she could respond, the tone shifted. The taller officer leaned closer, his face inches from hers. "You need to show some respect," he snapped. And then came the words that made Danielle's stomach drop. A racial slur, muttered low, but unmistakable. Her heart raced. For a moment, she considered letting it slide. Maybe they'd realize their mistake, apologize, and let her go. But deep down, she knew better. These men weren't going to back down, so she did what anyone in her position would do. She stood her ground. "I'm a general in the United States Army," she said, her voice steady despite the knot tightening in her chest. "I deserve to be treated with dignity and professionalism." If anything, her statement only fueled their hostility. The shorter officer scoffed. "Yeah, right. Prove it. Prove it." Those 2 words stung. Danielle reached into her glove compartment, pulling out her military ID. She held it up, expecting recognition, even a hint of remorse. Instead, the officers exchanged glances, smirking, as if they didn't believe her, and then it got worse. Before she could react, the taller officer opened her car door and ordered her out. When she hesitated, he grabbed her arm, roughly pulling her onto the street. Danielle stumbled, shocked by the sudden force. Her hands were yanked behind her back, cold metal clicking around her wrists. Handcuffs. This can't be happening, she thought, her mind racing. Not to me. Not like this. As she sat in the back seat of the patrol car, anger and disbelief swirling inside her, Danielle noticed something crucial. Earlier, during the heated exchange, she'd instinctively pressed the record button on her phone. Every word, every insult, every threat, it was all captured. A small victory, perhaps, but one that might make all the difference. Little did those officers know their actions weren't just targeting a citizen that night. They were challenging someone who carried the weight of an entire institution behind her. And soon enough, the full force of that reality would come crashing down on them. Sitting in the back of that patrol car, Danielle felt a mix of emotions, anger, frustration, and disbelief. But above all, she felt determined. She wasn't just any civilian. She was a general in the U.S. Army, someone who had dedicated her life to serving her country. And now here she was, handcuffed because of a lie. It wasn't just about her anymore, it was about what this moment represented. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a reflection of something much bigger, something deeply ingrained in society. Danielle knew she couldn't let this slide. These officers might think they were untouchable, but she had connections, resources, and most importantly, proof. The recording on her phone was evidence that could expose their behavior for what it truly was. Still, she needed help. And fast. Sitting there in silence, she made a decision. She reached into her pocket with her cuffed hands and pulled out her phone. Thankfully, they hadn't taken it away. With trembling fingers, she dialed a number she knew by heart, a direct line to the Pentagon's Emergency Operations Center. The call connected almost instantly. On the other end, a voice answered, calm but alert. "This is Lieutenant Colonel Hayes," the man said. Danielle recognized his voice immediately. He was someone she trusted, someone who understood the gravity of situations like this. Without wasting time, she spoke clearly, making sure every word carried the weight of authority. "I'm General Rivers," she began, her tone measured but firm. "I'm currently being detained unlawfully by local police officers. They've shown blatant disregard for my rank and personhood." There was a pause on the other end. Then the colonel's voice grew sharper, more urgent. "Are you safe?" he asked. "For now," Danielle replied. "But I need you to act quickly. These officers are acting outside protocol, and I have reason to believe this stop was racially motivated." The colonel didn't hesitate. "Understood. Stay calm, General. We'll handle this." Danielle exhaled slowly, feeling a flicker of relief. She knew the wheels were already turning. The Pentagon wasn't just some distant institution. It was a machine, and when something like this happened, it moved swiftly. Within minutes, senior officials were alerted. Calls were made, emails sent, and plans put into motion. What started as a routine traffic stop in a small town was suddenly a matter of national importance. Meanwhile, the two officers remained oblivious to the storm brewing around them. Back at the precinct, they chatted casually, cracking jokes about how difficult the woman in the back seat had been. To them, this was just another night on the job. They had no idea that their actions were being dissected at the highest levels of government. They had no idea that their careers, and possibly their freedom, were hanging by a thread. At the Pentagon, news of the incident spread like wildfire. High-ranking officials gathered in a secure conference room, poring over details as they came. Screens displayed maps, live updates, and even snippets of the audio recording Danielle had captured. Every word she'd spoken, every insult hurled at her, was crystal clear. It painted a damning picture of abuse of power and racial bias. One official slammed his fist on the table. "This isn't just an attack on a citizen," he said, his voice rising. "This is an attack on the integrity of the U.S. military. If we don't address this, what message does it send?" Another nodded grimly. "We can't afford to ignore this. Not with everything happening in the country right now." It wasn't just about Danielle, it was about symbolism. Here was a decorated general, a leader in one of the most respected institutions in the world, being treated like a criminal because of the color of her skin. The implications were staggering. If this could happen to her, what hope did ordinary citizens have? President Harris was briefed shortly after. Known for her strong stance on civil rights, she listened intently as advisors outlined the situation. When they finished, she leaned forward, her expression serious. "This is unacceptable," she said firmly. "We cannot stand by while our heroes are treated this way. Make it clear, justice will be served." Her words echoed through the halls of power, setting off a chain reaction. Federal agents were dispatched to the scene, tasked with ensuring Danielle's release and gathering evidence against the officers. Meanwhile, public relations teams prepared statements, knowing full well that this story would explode once it hit the media. Back in the patrol car, Danielle sat quietly, her mind racing. She knew things were moving behind the scenes, but she also knew patience was key. The officers returned to the car briefly, glancing at her with smug expressions. "You're causing a lot of trouble for yourself," one of them said, shaking his head. Danielle didn't respond. She didn't need to. Deep down, she knew the truth would come out. And when it did, these men would regret ever laying a hand on her. Hours passed before headlights appeared in the distance. At first, Danielle thought it was just another squad car, but as the vehicles drew closer, she realized they weren't local police, they were federal agents. Armed and dressed in tactical gear, they approached the scene with precision and purpose. The two officers froze, confusion written all over their faces. "What's going on?" one of them demanded, stepping forward. A federal agent held up a badge. "Stand down," he commanded. "This situation is under federal jurisdiction now." The officers exchanged nervous glances, but complied. Within moments, Danielle was freed from the handcuffs. She stepped out of the car, rubbing her wrists, her posture radiating quiet strength. As the agents escorted her to safety, she turned to look at the two men who had wronged her. There was no anger in her gaze, only resolve. They had underestimated her, and now they would pay the price. By morning, the story was everywhere. News outlets picked it up, social media erupted, and protests began to form. People across the country were outraged, not just because of what had happened to Danielle, but because it highlighted a systemic issue that many had been fighting against for years. Racism in law enforcement wasn't new, but seeing it play out so blatantly against someone of Danielle's stature made it impossible to ignore. For the officers involved, the nightmare was only beginning. Their names became synonymous with injustice, their actions scrutinized under a microscope. Friends distanced themselves, colleagues avoided them, and their once stable lives crumbled overnight. They had made a grave mistake, and the consequences would follow them for the rest of their lives. As for Danielle, she emerged from the ordeal stronger than ever. Her courage inspired countless others to speak out against discrimination and demand change. What started as a dark night on a quiet road had transformed into a catalyst for progress. And though the road ahead wouldn't be easy, Danielle knew she had sparked something powerful, a movement toward accountability, equality, and justice. The days following Danielle's arrest turned into a whirlwind of activity. News outlets couldn't get enough of the story. Headlines screamed about racism in uniform and abuse of power against a military leader. Social media platforms lit up with hashtags like "Justice for the General" and "End Police Bias." People from all walks of life, students, activists, veterans, and everyday citizens, were talking about what had happened. It wasn't just anger, it was disbelief. How could two officers treat someone so highly respected in such a degrading way? Danielle became the face of resilience. Her calm demeanor during interviews struck a chord with millions. She didn't lash out or seek revenge. Instead, she used her platform to speak about accountability and systemic change. In one interview, she looked directly into the camera and said, "This isn't about me. This is about every person who has been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. If we don't address this now, we're failing as a society." Her words resonated deeply. Protesters gathered outside police stations across the country, holding signs that read, "Respect our heroes," and "No justice, no peace." The pressure mounted on local authorities to take action. People demanded answers. Why were these officers still employed? What measures were being taken to prevent similar incidents in the future? Behind the scenes, investigations kicked into high gear. Federal agents combed through every detail of the traffic stop. They reviewed the audio recording Danielle had captured, which painted a vivid picture of the officer's behavior. Every racial slur, every dismissive comment, every attempt to intimidate her, it was all there, undeniable proof of misconduct. Witnesses came forward too, sharing stories of times they'd seen the same officers act aggressively toward people of color. Meanwhile, the Department of Defense stepped in, sending representatives to meet with Danielle personally. They assured her that her case wouldn't be swept under the rug. High-ranking officials held emergency meetings, discussing how to hold the officers accountable while also addressing the larger issue of racial bias in law enforcement. For the first time in years, real conversations about reform began to take shape. But for the two officers involved, life spiraled out of control. Once proud of their badges, they now faced intense scrutiny. Their colleagues distanced themselves, embarrassed by association. Friends stopped answering their calls. Even their families struggled to defend them. One officer's teenage son reportedly refused to talk to him, ashamed of his father's actions. The weight of public opinion crushed them, turning their once stable lives upside down. Legal proceedings soon followed. Charges were filed against both men, ranging from unlawful detainment to racial profiling. Their mugshots appeared on news websites, accompanied by scathing editorials condemning their behavior. Lawyers scrambled to build a defense, arguing that the officers had simply made a mistake and hadn't realized Danielle's rank. But the evidence was overwhelming. The audio recording alone was enough to seal their fate. As the trial date approached, tensions ran high. Supporters of Danielle organized rallies outside the courthouse, chanting slogans and waving flags. Others showed up to protest, claiming the officers were being unfairly targeted. Emotions flared on both sides, creating an atmosphere thick with tension. Security was tightened, and police presence increased to prevent any potential clashes. Inside the courtroom, things were no less dramatic. Prosecutors laid out their case methodically, presenting the audio recording, witness testimonies, and expert analysis, showing that Danielle's taillights were fully functional. They argued that the officers had fabricated the reason for the traffic stop and acted out of prejudice rather than protocol. Defense attorneys fought back, trying to cast doubt on the prosecution's narrative. They claimed their clients were overworked and stressed, suggesting that their remarks were taken out of context. But the jury wasn't buying it. Each day of testimony brought new revelations, painting a damning portrait of the officers' conduct. Throughout the trial, Danielle remained composed. She testified in court, recounting the events of that night with clarity and poise. When asked how she felt during the ordeal, she paused before responding. "I felt powerless," she admitted, "but I also felt determined. I knew I couldn't let this go unanswered." Her honesty struck a nerve with everyone in the room. Even some of the jurors later admitted that her testimony left a lasting impression. It wasn't just her words, it was the way she carried herself with dignity and strength despite everything she'd endured. After weeks of deliberation, the verdict finally came in. Both officers were found guilty on multiple counts. Gasps filled the courtroom as the judge announced their sentences: prison time and permanent revocation of their badges. Outside, cheers erupted from the crowd gathered to hear the decision. Strangers hugged each other, tears streaming down their faces. Justice had been served, or at least that's what many believed. For Danielle, the victory was bittersweet. While she was glad the officers had been held accountable, she knew this was only the beginning. Punishing two individuals wouldn't fix the deeper issues plaguing law enforcement. Real change required more than convictions. It required a shift in mindset, policies, and training, and she was ready to lead the charge. In the weeks that followed, Danielle threw herself into advocacy work. She traveled across the country, speaking at town halls, schools, and community centers. She shared her story not to dwell on the pain, but to inspire others to stand up against injustice. Everywhere she went, people listened. Veterans saluted her. Young activists sought her advice. Parents told their children, "This is what courage looks like." Local governments began implementing reforms inspired by Danielle's case. Some departments introduced mandatory cultural sensitivity training for officers. Others adopted stricter disciplinary measures for misconduct. Body cameras became standard equipment, ensuring transparency in interactions between police and civilians. Progress was slow, but it was happening. Still, Danielle knew the fight wasn't over. Racism wasn't something that could be eradicated overnight. It was a deeply rooted problem that required constant vigilance and effort. But she also knew that moments like hers, the moments when people stood together and demanded change, were powerful. They reminded everyone that hope wasn't lost, that progress was possible if enough people cared enough to push for it. And so, Danielle kept moving forward, one step at a time. She didn't do it for fame or recognition. She did it because she believed in a better future, a future where no one, regardless of their rank or background, would have to endure what she had gone through. Her journey wasn't easy, but it was worth it. Because sometimes standing up for what's right means paving the way for others to follow. The trial of the two officers became a spectacle that gripped the nation. Every day, reporters camped outside the courthouse, microphones in hand, eager to capture even the smallest detail. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with tension. Lawyers argued passionately. Witnesses recounted their stories and jurors listened intently, their faces reflecting the weight of the decision they would soon have to make. It wasn't just a legal battle, it was a moral reckoning. Danielle sat quietly through much of the proceedings, her expression calm but resolute. She didn't need to raise her voice or dramatize her pain. Her presence alone spoke volumes. When it was her turn to testify, she walked to the stand with purpose, her head held high. The room fell silent as she began to speak, her voice steady and clear. She started by describing the night of the traffic stop, the flashing lights in her rearview mirror, the officer's aggressive tone, and the racial slurs that followed. She recounted how she had tried to explain herself, presenting her military ID only to be met with disbelief and hostility. "I've spent my life serving this country," she said, pausing for effect. "But that night, I wasn't treated like a general. I wasn't even treated like a human being." Her words struck a chord. Jurors leaned forward, hanging on every syllable. Even the judge seemed moved, nodding slightly as she spoke. Danielle didn't mince words. She described the humiliation of being handcuffed, the fear of not knowing what might happen next, and the anger that came from realizing these men thought they could get away with treating her this way. But she also talked about hope, the hope that telling her story might spark change, that others wouldn't have to endure what she had. When she finished speaking, there was a long pause before the prosecutor thanked her. As she returned to her seat, the crowd erupted into quiet murmurs. Some wiped tears from their eyes. Others exchanged glances, clearly affected by what they'd heard. It was a turning point in the trial, a moment when the humanity of the case became impossible to ignore. As the days went on, more evidence piled up against the officers. The audio recording Danielle had captured was played multiple times in court. Each playback revealed new layers of their misconduct: the dismissive remarks, the thinly veiled racism, the outright refusal to acknowledge her rank. Experts testified that the taillight issue was fabricated, pointing out that both lights were fully functional based on data logs from Danielle's vehicle. Witnesses shared stories of similar encounters with the same officers, painting a pattern of behavior that left little room for doubt. Defense attorneys fought back fiercely, trying to cast their clients in a sympathetic light. They argued that the officers were overworked and under immense pressure, suggesting that their actions were a result of stress rather than prejudice. They claimed Danielle's military status had clouded the situation, making it seem worse than it actually was. But their arguments felt hollow, especially when faced with the mountain of evidence stacked against them. The verdict came on a Tuesday morning, the kind of day where the air feels heavy with anticipation. The courtroom was packed. Lawyers, reporters, activists, and ordinary citizens filled every seat, their eyes glued to the jury as they filed. And one by one, you could hear a pin drop. Danielle sat upright, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She didn't show it, but inside she was a storm of emotions, hope, fear, and determination swirling together. The foreman stood, his voice steady as he read the decision. On the charge of unlawful detainment, guilty. On the charge of racial profiling, guilty. On the charge of misconduct, guilty. Each word landed like a hammer, echoing through the room. For a moment there was silence, a collective pause as everyone processed what had just happened. Then, slowly, applause broke out. It started softly, almost hesitant, but quickly grew louder, filling the space with a sense of triumph. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted. People hugged, cheered, and chanted slogans. Some held signs that read, "Accountability matters and justice prevails." Strangers high-fived each other, united by a shared sense of victory. It wasn't just about punishing two officers. It was about sending a message that racism and abuse of power wouldn't be tolerated anymore. For Danielle, though, the moment was bittersweet. As reporters swarmed her for comments, she took a deep breath before speaking. "Today is not just about me," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "It's about everyone who has faced injustice and been told to stay silent. This verdict shows that change is possible, but we still have so much work to do." She meant it. While the trial had brought attention to the issue, Danielle knew this was only the beginning. Two guilty verdicts wouldn't fix decades of systemic problems. Real change required more than convictions. It needed action, policy reform, and education. And Danielle was ready to lead the charge. In the weeks following the trial, Danielle threw herself into advocacy work. She traveled across the country, visiting cities and towns to speak at community meetings, schools, and conferences. Her speeches weren't flashy or overly rehearsed. They were raw, honest, and deeply personal. She talked about her experience, yes, but she also listened. She wanted to hear from people who had faced similar struggles, those whose voices often went unheard. One evening, during a town hall in a small Midwestern city, a young woman stood up to ask a question. "What should I do if something like this happens to me?" she asked, her voice trembling. Danielle leaned forward, her gaze soft but unwavering. "You document everything," she replied. "Use your phone, write things down, whatever you can. And don't let anyone make you feel like you're less than you are. Stand tall even when it's hard." The room erupted in applause, and the young woman wiped tears from her eyes. Moments like these reminded Danielle why she was doing this. Not for fame or recognition, but to empower others to stand up for themselves. Meanwhile, governments and organizations began taking steps toward reform. Inspired by Danielle's case, several police departments implemented new training programs focused on cultural sensitivity and de-escalation techniques. Body cameras became mandatory in many areas, ensuring transparency in interactions between officers and civilians. Lawmakers introduced bills aimed at holding law enforcement accountable for misconduct, with harsher penalties for violations. But not everyone was happy about the changes. Critics argued that reforms would make policing harder, claiming officers were being unfairly targeted. Protests popped up in various cities, with some supporting Danielle's cause and others defending the status quo. Tensions ran high, and debates raged on social media. Danielle watched it all unfold, knowing that progress often came with resistance. She didn't shy away from the criticism. Instead, she addressed it head-on. During an interview on a popular morning show, the host asked her about the backlash. "Some people say you're making things worse for law enforcement," he said. "What do you say to them?" Danielle smiled faintly, leaning back in her chair. "I say this. Good policing isn't about protecting bad apples. It's about building trust with the communities officers serve. If someone joins the force to help people, they should welcome accountability. Real heroes aren't afraid of scrutiny. They embrace it because they know it makes them better." Her answer earned her nods of approval from viewers and further cemented her reputation as a thoughtful, yet unflinching leader. People admired her ability to stay composed under pressure, to turn anger into action without letting bitterness consume her. Back home, Danielle found solace in small moments. She spent evenings gardening, tending to flowers and vegetables in her backyard. It was her way of grounding herself after long days of travel and activism. Sometimes neighbors would stop by to chat, thanking her for her courage. She always smiled and told them the same thing. "This fight belongs to all of us. I'm just one piece of the puzzle." As months turned into years, Danielle's efforts began bearing fruit. Communities reported improved relationships with local police forces. Officers trained under the new programs spoke openly about how the changes helped them connect better with residents. Schools incorporated discussions about racial bias and justice into their curriculums, teaching kids early on about fairness and equality. Of course, challenges remained. Racism didn't vanish overnight, and there were still instances of misconduct that made headlines. But Danielle's story served as a reminder that progress was possible, and that ordinary people could spark extraordinary change. At a ceremony honoring her contributions, Danielle stood on stage, looking out at a sea of faces. She thought about the night she'd been pulled over, the fear and frustration she'd felt. But she also thought about the countless individuals who had reached out to thank her, who had found strength in her example. Taking a deep breath, she addressed the crowd. "When I was handcuffed in that patrol car, I didn't know what the future held," she said, her voice steady. "But I did know one thing. I couldn't stay silent. Silence never changed anything. So I chose to speak up, to fight back, not just for myself, but for everyone who deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. And today I see how far we've come. But let me be clear, our work isn't done. We keep pushing, keep fighting until no one has to endure what I did. That's how we honor this moment." The audience erupted in applause, standing as one to cheer for the woman who had become a symbol of resilience and hope. Danielle smiled, feeling a surge of gratitude for the support she'd received, for the progress they'd made, and for the journey ahead. Change wasn't easy, but it was worth it, and Danielle Rivers was determined to see it through. Years passed, and Danielle's story became more than just a memory. It turned into a legacy. The woman who had once sat handcuffed in the back of a patrol car was now celebrated as a trailblazer, a symbol of strength and resilience. Her journey wasn't easy, but it was impactful. She didn't set out to be a hero. She simply wanted justice for herself and others like her. Yet, somehow, she ended up inspiring an entire generation. Danielle eventually retired from active duty, trading her uniform for a quieter life. But retirement didn't mean stepping away from the fight. If anything, it gave her more time to focus on the causes she cared about most. She wrote books, gave lectures, and mentored young leaders eager to make a difference. Her words carried weight because they came from experience, not theory or speculation, but real-life lessons learned through struggle. One of her books, titled Standing Tall, Lessons from the Backseat of a Patrol Car, became a bestseller. In it, she shared not only her own story but also stories of people she'd met along the way, ordinary citizens who had faced injustice and found the courage to stand up against it. Each chapter ended with a call to action, urging readers to reflect on their role in creating a fairer society. It wasn't just a memoir, it was a guidebook for change. Her advocacy work extended beyond writing. Danielle partnered with organizations focused on criminal justice reform, helping craft policies that prioritized accountability and equity. She worked closely with police departments, offering insights on how to build trust with communities. Officers who attended her workshops often left inspired, saying things like, "She made me see my job differently," or, "I never realized how much power I have to make a positive impact." But Danielle's influence reached far beyond policy changes and training programs. She became a cultural icon, someone people looked up to when times got tough. Parents named their daughters after her, hoping they'd grow up to embody the same strength and grace. Schools introduced curriculums based on her teachings, ensuring that future generations understood the importance of standing up for what's right. In one small town, a group of high school students started a club called the Stand Tall Initiative. They organized community cleanups, held discussions about racial bias, and even invited local law enforcement officers to join them for open dialogues. When Danielle heard about the club, she visited the town to meet the students personally. Sitting in their cafeteria, surrounded by teenagers buzzing with energy, she felt a sense of pride she hadn't expected. "You're doing amazing work," she told them, her voice warm. "Don't ever underestimate the power of your voices. Change starts with conversations like these." The students listened intently, hanging on her every word. Afterward, they lined up to take selfies with her, laughing and thanking her for coming. For Danielle, moments like these reminded her why she kept going. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about planting seeds of hope and watching them grow. As the years went on, monuments and memorials began popping up in her honor. One of the most notable was a statue erected outside the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. The sculpture depicted Danielle standing tall, her arms crossed, and her expression firm, yet compassionate. Beneath it, an inscription read, "Courage is contagious. Let hers inspire yours." Every day, visitors stopped to admire the statue, reading the plaque and snapping photos. Some brought flowers, leaving them at the base as a sign of respect. Others stood quietly, reflecting on what Danielle's story meant to them. It wasn't just a tribute to one person. It was a reminder of the collective effort needed to create lasting change. For the two officers involved in Danielle's arrest, life took a very different turn. After serving their prison sentences, they struggled to reintegrate into society. Their names were forever linked to shame, making it nearly impossible to find steady jobs or rebuild relationships. Friends and family distanced themselves, unable to reconcile with the men's actions. They lived in obscurity, haunted by the choices they'd made that night. Occasionally, interviews surfaced featuring one of the officers expressing regret. "I wish I could go back and do things differently," he said in one televised segment. "But I can't. All I can do is try to learn from my mistakes." While some dismissed his apology as too little, too late, others saw it as proof that even those who commit grave wrongs can seek redemption if they're willing to face the consequences of their actions. Danielle rarely spoke about the officers anymore. When asked during interviews, she simply said, "What's done is done. My focus is on the future, not the past." And she meant it. She believed in second chances, but she also believed in accountability. Forgiveness, she often said, wasn't about forgetting. It was about moving forward without letting bitterness consume you. By the time Danielle reached her late 60s, she had become a grandmother. Watching her grandkids play in the backyard filled her with joy and perspective. She loved telling them stories, not just about her adventures in the military, but also about the importance of kindness, fairness, and standing up for others. "Be brave," she'd tell them, kneeling down to meet their curious eyes. "Even when it's scary, always choose to do the right thing." Her family threw a big party to celebrate her 70th birthday. Friends, colleagues, and strangers whose lives she'd touched gathered to honor her. Speeches were given, tears were shed, and laughter filled the air. At the end of the night, Danielle stood to address the crowd. "I never imagined my life would turn out this way," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "When I was younger, I just wanted to serve my country and make a difference. I didn't plan to become a symbol of anything. But here we are, all of us together, working toward a better world. That's what matters most, the we. None of this would have been possible without each of you." Applause erupted, echoing long after she finished speaking. As she stepped down from the stage, someone handed her a photo album filled with memories from over the years. Pictures of protests, speeches, award ceremonies, and quiet moments with loved ones. Flipping through the pages, Danielle smiled, softly, feeling grateful for everything she'd experienced. Looking back, she realized her story wasn't just about handcuffs or courtrooms. It was about humanity. It was about choosing courage over fear, love over hate, and progress over stagnation. She had started as one person fighting for justice, but she had ignited a movement that spanned generations. And so, Danielle Rivers' legacy endured, not as a relic of the past, but as a beacon for the future. Her story reminded everyone that, no matter how dark things might seem, there's always room for light. All it takes is one person willing to stand tall, even when the odds feel insurmountable.